Welcome to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Work. Focused solely on workplace issues, it is our job to help employers develop proactive strategies, strong policies, and business-oriented solutions to cultivate an engaged, stable, and inclusive workforce. Our podcast identifies issues that influence and impact the workplace and its continuing evolution, and helps answer the question on every employer's mind: how will my business be impacted? Earlier this year, the DEA responded to President Biden's directive to reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. This pivotal change, if finalized, would reclassify marijuana as a drug with moderate to low potential for dependence, strictly for medical use. While not federally legalized, this shift opens new avenues for medical applications and regulatory compliance, impacting healthcare organizations. On this episode of We Get Work, we discuss the notice of proposed rulemaking to reschedule cannabis and the questions and difficulties that employers face when enforcing their drug policies. Our hosts today are Catherine Russo and Catherine Cano, principals in Jackson Lewis's Long Island and Omaha offices, and members of the Drug Testing and Substance Abuse Management Group. Catherine and Catherine, the question on everyone's mind today is, what are the workplace policy implications if the transfer to Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act is finalized? And how does that impact my business?
Thank you. We're happy to be here. This is Catherine Russo, and I'm here with my partner, Catherine Cano. And today we're going to talk about the potential federal rescheduling of marijuana and how that is going to impact employers, and particularly how it will impact healthcare employers. So Catherine and I were talking yesterday about how, one of the most common questions we get from employers is, why do we have to comply with state and local marijuana laws when technically it's still illegal under federal law? So the short answer to that is that the federal government has been ignoring the law that makes marijuana illegal, and they've been ignoring it for over a decade now. And Congress has expressly prohibited the Department of Justice from using federal funds to interfere with state and local marijuana laws. So in effect, the federal government has allowed the states to regulate marijuana for over a decade. But there's a lot of problems with that, a couple of which are that because marijuana is still illegal under federal law, that prohibits medical research into whether marijuana can be used as a medicine. And it also inhibits or impedes banks and other financial institutions from funding cannabis businesses. So those are the two big obstacles. And for those reasons, there's been a big push to legalize marijuana or at least reschedule it. So what is rescheduling? What prompted us to do this podcast, as you may know, is back in May, the Department of Justice published a notice of proposed rulemaking, which is what they need to do to reschedule a drug from one schedule to another. So under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Administration, classifies all drugs into 5 distinct categories or schedules, depending on the drug's acceptable medical use and its potential for abuse or dependence. So Schedule 1 drugs are the worst. They're defined as having no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. That's things like heroin, and marijuana is in Schedule 1. So marijuana is basically considered to be as bad as heroin. And then we have additional schedules. It goes down to Schedule 5. And as you get lower in the schedules, Schedule 5 drugs are those that have the least amount of potential for abuse. So this current proposed rule would move marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. So Schedule 3 drugs are defined as drugs with a moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. And other examples of Schedule 3 drugs are Tylenol with codeine, ketamine, anabolic steroids. So it's just going to be moved down so that it won't be considered to be as bad as drugs like heroin, and that will allow medical research, It'll allow, funding for cannabis businesses. So it should help with a lot of things. But what I want to stress, though, is it's not going to legalize marijuana altogether. So, these schedules are really for medical use. So if it gets moved to Schedule 3, marijuana is just going to be considered a drug with a moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence, and it would be available for medical use only, and it won't be legal, altogether for all purposes. So then you may be wondering, well, why are we doing this and why now? I mean, that's always a big question, is why now? So the reason this happened in May is that this was a big issue for the Biden administration. And the Biden administration has been pushing and prodding the Department of Justice and the DEA to get this done because back in 2020, President Biden made a campaign promise that he was going to fix the marijuana laws in the country and decriminalize marijuana. And at the time that this rule came out, President Biden thought he was going to be running for re-election. So, his administration was very big on, we got to get this done. We have to do it before Election Day because, he clearly was planning to campaign on this. But as we know now, President Biden is not running for re-election. And so there's really a lot less pressure on the DEA. And quite honestly, when this first happened, I couldn't imagine how the DEA would get this done before Election Day. I couldn't imagine it because it's a very long process. As Catherine's going to tell you in a second, it's a long, slow process to reschedule a drug. So I think there's less pressure on DEA now. And we also have this election coming up, right? So right now, today is October 23rd. The election is coming up soon. I think both candidates support the rescheduling to Schedule 3. Donald Trump indicated on his social media platform that he supports the rescheduling to Schedule 3, as well as marijuana decriminalization. And Kamala Harris also has said she supports the Biden administration's proposal to move it to Schedule 3, as well as decriminalization. And more recently, within the last week or two, she has also said that she supports the legalization of recreational adult use marijuana. So it'll be interesting, depending on who gets elected. It'll be interesting to see what happens. And the other thing is, of course, after the election, they could change their minds and do something else. So, we don't really know what's going to happen, but here we are. So, Catherine, why don't you tell us a little bit, what's the current status? This has been pending for several months now. What's the current status of the rescheduling? And do we think this is likely to happen this year?
I don't know if this is likely to happen in my lifetime, Catherine. No, I'm kidding. I think it will happen in my lifetime, but it's definitely not going to be this year, or it's very unlikely that it would happen this year. I know some people had hoped for a determination on rescheduling by the DEA before Election Day, but it's a whole process. So DEA has scheduled a public hearing for sometime in early 2025. And the purpose for that hearing is to receive factual evidence and expert opinion regarding whether marijuana should be transferred to a Schedule 3 status under the Controlled Substances Act. Once the hearing is completed, the presiding administrative law judge will write and file a report on the testimony provided. After that happens, the DEA still needs to review the report and write its final rulemaking, and that rulemaking has to take into consideration all the relevant materials presented during the public comment period. So to recap, we have a public hearing, we have to have a written report from an administrative law judge, and then the DEA needs to review that and make its own final rule. DEA received more than 43,000 comments regarding its notice of proposed rulemaking, and it could be months or, like I said, years before we get a determination here. DEA has denied petitions to reschedule marijuana in the past because the scientific evidence supporting the medical and other benefits of marijuana was lacking. So DEA will be looking for submission of medical and other evidence supporting a rescheduling. Some have pointed out that medical evidence about marijuana's medicinal properties is lacking because research can't be conducted on a drug that's illegal. It makes it extremely difficult to do research when it's already a Schedule 1 substance, right? But many proponents of rescheduling support that rescheduling so that more scientific research about marijuana can be conducted. And maybe one silver lining from the fact that we have a bunch of states that are just doing their own thing and not following federal law is that we potentially have more evidence to go off of than if everybody was just treating it as a Schedule 1 substance under state law as well. So the proposed rule focused on a number of issues that DEA will evaluate before making its decision. The topics are, first, the drug's actual or relative potential for abuse. In 2016, DEA found that marijuana had a high potential for abuse and now recommends gathering additional data to assess marijuana's actual or relative potential for abuse. They're looking at the scientific evidence of its pharmacological effect, if known. So in the past 30 years, the potency of marijuana's Delta-9 THC has dramatically increased, so they're looking for evidence there. The status of current scientific knowledge regarding the drug or other substance. DEA here has noted that additional data regarding routes of administration of marijuana and the impact on Delta-9 THC potency may be appropriate for consideration. The history and current pattern of abuse, that's, again, another thing that DEA is looking for. And in 2016, DEA found that marijuana is the most widely used illicit drug. I'm sure that that's probably still true, particularly as we have more and more states since 2016 that have legalized it on a recreational basis. So it's pretty widely available. The scope and duration and significance of abuse is another factor that DEA is looking at. In 2016, DEA found that abuse of marijuana was widespread and one of the primary drugs leading to the admission for substance abuse treatment. What, if any, risk there is to the public health? In 2016, again, DEA, they weren't favoring marijuana at that time. They said that marijuana posed a number of risks to public health, including impaired driving and physical and psychological dependence. And I think the impaired driving thing is certainly something that has been a struggle in states that have recreational marijuana, where they've been trying to figure out how to address that. As we'll talk about a little bit later, there's some testing challenges around marijuana. And then the last piece that DEA is looking at evidence on is the psychic or physiological dependence liability associated with marijuana. In 2016, DEA found that long-term heavy use of marijuana can lead to physical and psychological dependence, and that this dependence is underdiagnosed and undertreated in the medical setting. So there are a lot of things that they're looking at before they can make that decision. But like I said, we have the hearing coming up in the beginning of 2025, and we'll see what kind of information they receive then. So, Catherine, going back to you, what are some of the questions being raised about rescheduling marijuana to a Schedule 3 substance?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions. So even if we get to Schedule 3, which seems to be what a lot of people want, there's some huge, huge questions. I think the first big one that has been raised by some organizations who have submitted comments to DEA is, how is that going to impact federally regulated industries that are required to test for marijuana? So some of you may know that, the U.S. Department of Transportation has drug and alcohol testing regulations that mandates marijuana testing for certain transportation workers, people like commercial motor vehicle drivers, bus drivers, pilots, train operators, and other people in the transportation industry. But the law that applies to them, which is the mandatory guidelines for federal workplace drug testing, it only allows testing for drugs in Schedules 1 and 2 of the Controlled Substances Act. So, of course, this has led many people to say, hey, wait a second, if marijuana gets moved to Schedule 3, does that mean that we can't test pilots and truck drivers for marijuana? So there's a lot of, real outrage by employers and companies in the transportation industry